live action Friday colloquia here at the Kinder Institute. This isn't the very first one, but this is the first time I think someone has come to visit from outside. It's been real since we've been doing it, which turned out to be quite a thing because I visited the Arctic Research Station / airport last night at 9:30 p.m. to get our guests because all the cabs and rental car companies and Good Samaritans of mid-Missouri apparently had abandoned the airport to its fate. So, but we appreciate Chris Grasso for having made this dangerous trip to visit us, and all of you for coming out. A couple things before we get started. What order should I do this in? Usually, coming attractions. Next week, it's a whole huge number of things coming on. There is the history department is hosting at 5 p.m. on the 15th, hosting Dr. Monica Black from University of Tennessee with a demon-haunted land, witches, wonder doctors, and the ghosts of the past in post-World War II Germany. Post-World War II, though, I don't even, as an early Americanist, I don't even regard that as the past. But and frankly, it seems to be our present anyway, doesn't it? There's also, and if you really want to, you can go to that at 5 on Tuesday. And then there is something called the Kinloch Doc, a documentary that's being shown about Kinloch, Missouri at 6 at the Historical Society that we're just helping out with. And then next Friday, we have Ainsley Leisure of also Brown University, unrelated. In fact, I think, is there a third Brown person that we've had? I think.
I'll warn them about the airport.
Yeah, it's true. Well, we'll have to be on duty. People will be on duty next week. And Professor Leisure is going to be speaking on thoughts on the world, the political, and the black, more from the political theory side of Institute. Today, we have actually one of the greatest intellectual historians of early America. That is before he started writing about Civil War westerns and soap opera. Well, it's not a pop. With soap opera, it was before he started doing this exciting stuff. He did very large books on intellectual histories, a couple of which are award winners. See, I got everything. Speaking Aristocracy. You see my post-it notes in there. Speaking Aristocracy, Transforming Public Discourse in the 18th Century Connecticut, was published by the Omohundar Institute. The other institute, as we like to say, the Omohundar Institute in Williamsburg, where Chris taught for William & Mary, where Chris taught for many years. And then this one, which I don't know that people know as well, but they ought to, Skepticism in American Faith from the Revolution to the Civil War, which won the Shear Book Prize a couple of years ago. And then Chris, who was taught at St. Olaf College years ago, but taught for many years at William Mary College of William Mary, where he was also editor of William Mary Quarterly. Fortunately, it's one of those. It's a journal that the various journal rating bodies in the sky don't manage to seem to recognize. But it's one of the greatest, probably the greatest of all early American history journals. And I think Chris said he was there for like 13 years, which sounds like a lot of William Mary Quarterly readers' reports to read to me. So he should get hazard pay for doing that. And I guess after he left, he's going to talk about this, but then he's went into a very different direction. And this is something that, serving on committee with Chris, I realized was Chris Grasso is writing about Civil War Missouri. I was like, we got to hear about that. So before the book he's going to talk about today, he's got another one called Bloody Engagements, John R. Kelso's Civil War, which is I guess is only the first half of the stuff he's going to talk about here. But then he's going to talk about his new book about John R. Kelso here. And even though we didn't manage to get the bookstore here, I wanted everyone to know that Oxford University Press has arranged a special, I don't know if it's this week only or how long it lasts. I don't know if it lasts, but it's a special Kinder Institute Colloquium 30% discount on this book, which I think Allison's going to put in the comments of the live stream. But we've also, for those of you who are actually here, we have flyers where you can put down that you can get the code here, and maybe Chris can sign your flyer and promise to sign it for you later on. Final thing is I wanted to make sure Chris presented me with, apparently he's with a special John R. Kelso hat that apparently he had made, which I thought was pretty cool to have commemorative hats made. I'm going to have to remember to do that for all of my future works, or maybe my past ones. So I wanted to present Chris with a commemorative Kinder Institute. Clothed in fully in Kinder Institute materials. After, if the talk goes well. Here we go. So he's got his water in too. So I'll turn it over to Chris, and don't forget, we'll be having Pursuit of Happiness Hour will begin at some when this is over. So, but Chris can talk as long as he wants.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank all of you for coming. I was a little worried with the snow and all this is closed and that's closed, but thanks for all of you for coming out on this snowy day. Thanks to Professor Hasley for inviting me to the Kinder Institute for hosting this event. I will be talking this afternoon about that book that you see up there, Teacher, Preacher, Soldier, Spy, The Civil Wars of John R. Kelso, but I'd also like to talk about the challenges of historical biography in general, and of writing this one in particular. This book is it's an account of an extraordinary 19th century American life, a school teacher and Methodist preacher in Missouri. In the Civil War, he earned fame fighting rebel guerrillas. Seeking personal revenge, as well as defending the Union, he vowed to slay 25 rebels with his own hand. And when he did so, he was elected to Congress. As a radical Republican in the House of Representatives during Reconstruction, he was one of the first to call for the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. After his term in Congress, personal tragedy drove him west, where he became a free-thinking lecturer and author, an atheist, a spiritualist, and before his death in 1891, an anarchist. John R. Kelso was many things. He was also a strong-willed son, a passionate husband, and a loving and grieving father. The Civil War remained central to his life, challenging his notions about politics, religion, morality, and human nature. Throughout his life, too, he fought private wars, not only against former friends and alienated family members, rebellious students and disaffected church congregations, political opponents and religious critics, but also against the warring impulses of his own complex character. His life story, moreover, offers a unique vantage upon dimensions of 19th century America that we usually don't see treated together. Religious revivalism and political anarchism, sex, divorce, and Civil War battles, free thinking, and the Wild West. I first came across Kelso when doing research on the previous book that Jeff talked about, Skepticism and American Faith from the Revolution to the Civil War. This is a big book, took a long time. I was editing it quarterly, so it took an even longer time. And I would go to archive looking for things, anything that's relevant to religious doubt, people struggling with religious skepticism, either privately or publicly challenging religious faith. So I was at the Huntington Library in California, and the finding aid for a recently acquired item suggested that the manuscript by someone named Kelso, whom I've never heard of, his manuscript works would have something that might address this topic. So I called it up, and the archivist delivered this gigantic elephant folio, 800 pages long, all filled, every page with manuscript writing by someone named Kelso. Speeches, poetry, lectures, book chapters. And then in the last 140 pages in this volume, handwritten, was a partial memoir which included details of his Civil War adventures up through January of 1863. So I used Kelso's pre-war experience with religion and struggling with faith and doubt as part of my chapter in the Skepticism book. And then I published that smaller volume that Jeff showed me, Bloody Engagements, is an edited and annotated version of Kelso's Civil War chapters in this Huntington volume. But I knew this extraordinarily rich material that had been barely seen by any other historian because it had been in private hands until just a few years before I saw it at the Huntington, deserved a book of its own, a historical biography. But how do you write a historical biography? There's the engagements. About 20 years ago, Jill Lepore published an often cited article called Historians Who Love Too Much. In it, she tried to distinguish biographies from microhistories that focus on an individual. Biographies, in Lepore's view, tend to focus on, quote, the singularity and significance of an individual's contribution to history, while microhistory is founded on the opposite assumption, using a single life as an allegory for the culture as a whole. Biographers try to recapitulate a life story. Microhistorians, focusing usually on the less famous people with less abundant records, tend to address themselves to small mysteries about a person's life as a means to exploring the culture. Biographers identify with their biographical subject. Sometimes they worry about over-identifying with their biographical subject. Microhistorians, and again, this is still Lepore, microhistorians identify instead with a different character in their story, usually a judge figure or a critic or a detective, someone who's helping them solve the mystery. But then in 2012, I attended a workshop on writing biography convened by Annette Gordon-Reed, the prominent historical biographer of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. And the workshop folks were around the table. I was not a participant, just in the audience. And I found that Lepore's distinctions didn't quite fit because the participants were working on a range of projects, from the famous to the obscure, Catholic saints, prominent scientists, but also marginalized indigenous people, enslaved Africans. And yet all of the writers wanted to recapitulate the life stories of their subjects. I jumped a second because I thought I was tipping this thing over. That wasn't a dramatic all, that was just, whoa, tables full. All the writers wanted to recapitulate the life stories of their subjects as fully as they were able. They also wanted to show how that life could illuminate broader historical issues and important historiographical questions. The key variable, it seemed to me, in determining the shape of historical biographical inquiry seemed to be the nature of the sources you're working with. Perhaps the two extremes can be illustrated by the source challenges faced by Robert Caro and his multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson, and Erica Dunbar, who wrote on Ona Judge, an enslaved woman who escaped from George and Martha Washington. Caro and the LBJ library faced 40,000 boxes of documents, over 32 million pages. Dunbar had two very brief newspaper interviews with Judge later in her life. Obviously, two very different source challenges. So what was mine? I had a rich, well, not as rich as LBJ, of course, but I had a rich archive of sources, especially the partial memoir, which was 95,000 words long. And I could put Kelso's text in context, build a social and cultural, political, and military history around his point of view with all the usual historical tools, census records, tax records, property records, official military records, newspapers, any other archival sources, any diary, letter, anything that was relevant to him in his life. Remember, though, that this incredibly rich memoir at the Huntington broke off on the last page at the end of January 1863. There was still much more Civil War to fight, and Kelso had nearly 3 decades more to live. But I'll return to that in a moment. Let me give you a better sense of his story first. John R. Kelso was born in 1831. He grew up in a rough backwoods cabin, ashamed of his patched trousers and dirty bare feet. He educated himself by the light of the fireplace and became a school teacher and then a popular Methodist preacher in the 1850s. But he soon lost his faith as his first marriage collapsed. When the southern states began seceding from the Union in the spring of 1861, he was a teacher living with his second wife and 3 children in the small town of Buffalo. See it there in Dallas County, right about the center. Small town of Buffalo in southwestern Missouri. Pro-secessionists dominated his hometown and county. But in a secessionist rally, Kelso dramatically jumped onto stage, interrupted the pro-Southern speaker, and rallied the Unionists to the flag. He was chosen to be a major in the Home Guard militia. Missouri, as I'm sure you all know, was a deeply divided state. After the South Carolina militia bombarded Fort Sumter in April, Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson rejected Lincoln's call for volunteers, ordered the state militia to assemble, and privately requested some artillery guns from Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Nearly 900 men then set up Camp Jackson in St. Louis, appearing to threaten the federal arsenal there. Nathaniel Lyon, commander of the St. Louis Arsenal, with about 8,000 Missouri volunteers and U.S. regulars, surrounded Camp Jackson and forced its surrender. During the march of the prisoners to the arsenal, secessionists in the streets of St. Louis began pelting the U.S. troops with rocks and debris, leading to gunfire. 28 people died, and many others were wounded. Governor Jackson called for 50,000 Missouri men to enlist in the State Guard to resist what he called federal despotism. Lyon led 2,500 troops from St. Louis to Jefferson City, but Governor Jackson and the State Guard forces, nearly as large, had already evacuated to the southwest. In Dallas County, Kelso was organizing a regiment of Home Guards to support Lyon. By early August, Lyon's forces were in Springfield. Just some picture of some of the paramilitary groups that had been forming in Missouri, it looked like. Kelso had organized some himself, and he met Lyon in Springfield shortly before the Battle of Wilson's Creek. On August 10, 1861, the Union Army led by Lyon was defeated by a considerably larger State Guard and Confederate force of 12,000 men at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, about 10 miles southwest of Springfield. This was the second big loss for the Union. The first Battle of Bull Run had been fought in Virginia 3 weeks earlier. Lyon was killed, and he becomes the first general to be mourned as a martyr in the Northern press. There's a romanticized painting, Battle of Wilson's Creek. The Union withdrew from the Southwest, and Kelso went with them, enlisting as a private. Remember, he was an officer in the Home Guard, but he enlisted as a private to make a statement about patriotism. He didn't have to be an officer. He was just going to serve his country. He went on his first spy mission back towards Springfield to get information about the enemy. This was the first of several spy missions that he would take into enemy territory. This is an illustration of one of them. He describes being sleeping with his back against a tree in a rain at night. So the artist is trying to depict that. On one of these spy missions, he pretended to be a Confederate recruiter named John Russell, his first and middle name, and he even gave speeches in support of the Southern cause to kind of support his cover story. On another one of these spy missions, he was captured and sentenced to death. And as the Confederate soldiers are building a gallows to hang him, he is able to escape. General John C. Fremont took command of Union forces. Known as the Pathfinder of the West and a presidential candidate in 1856, Fremont was out of his depth as a field commander. He marched slowly back down to Springfield with 18,000 men, but President Lincoln removed him on November 2nd, and the Union then retreated from the Southwest to Rolla and Sedalia. So as they retreat then, with the army gone, the secessionists start to prey on their Unionist neighbors. Kelso was ordered to help evacuate loyal families from his hometown in Buffalo. Guerrillas drove families, including Kelso's, from their homes into the snows of the war's first winter storm. and they burned Kelso's farmhouse to the ground. This is an illustration of the scene he describes in his memoir about being out in the storm. And there's this woman who's pregnant, and the wind is blowing, the storm and snow, and this pregnant woman gives birth to a child, and then the child dies, and then the woman dies. And of course, Kelso blames this on these secessionists who drove them there in the first place. They also burned down his house and destroyed his farm. And as the heroes in the movie say, this is when it got personal. Kelso, this is when Kelso swears that he would kill, and he has a scene where he vows before the full moon, I will swear that I will kill 25 rebels with my own hands. And he refused to cut his hair before he did so. Thus began the career of a man the Confederates would call a monster and the Unionists a hero. In midwinter of 1861, Kelso, on leave from his regiment, camped in the woods outside of Buffalo, his hometown, and extracted personal revenge on his enemies, appearing, it was said, like a ghost in the night. In February 1862, the Union launched another offensive with troops under the command of General Samuel R. Curtis. This is the guy who sent Kelso out on those spy missions. Kelso marched with Curtis into Arkansas, and the troops are really chasing the Confederates troops who had occupied Springfield, and then they're leaving. They're going south as fast as they can, and the Union forces are marching quickly behind them. Day after day, the tail of the Confederates and the head of the Federal forces kind of engage in a skirmish. Day after day, this happens, but then finally there's a big battle at Pea Ridge. This is showing where they come down. Go down, there's Pea Ridge just over the line in Arkansas. An important battle in the war for this region. After the Curtis and the Union forces defeat the Confederates at the Battle of Pea Ridge, the Confederates would never again hold Missouri territory, but through the rest of the war would periodically launch strikes up from Arkansas. One such major strike occurred in January of 1863. Confederate General John S. Marmaduke had moved his brigade quickly up from Arkansas and intended to take arms and provisions at the undermanned post at Springfield. After a day of intense fighting, there's a map showing that in the beginning, the troops are here, they're coming up from the south, and by the end of the day, they are kind of the apex of that triangle. And after this day of intense fighting, the defenders, including 6 soldiers that they had to pull from the hospital and prop up on bags of flour to shoot out from windows, the Union forces still held the town. Kelso fought on the battlefield all day long and then went alone into the rebel camp at night to spy. And he has this dramatic scene in his memoirs where he's crawling alone through the dark, and he's crawling among the dead bodies, and some are still wounded and are crying out. And then an ambulance wagon comes along, and he basically has to play possum, pretending he's dead. And he talks about this guy walking over him with a lantern, kind of kicking him. Oh, here's another dead body, and kicking him. And he's just kind of pretending he's dead. The Confederates were forced to retreat. They never took Springfield. The Southern sympathizers around Springfield weren't sure who won, and some of them came to town trying to collect, thinking that they could share in the booty. And when one of these guys did come to town, Kelso found him, the Southern sympathizer, and he forced him into Union service at the point of a bayonet. "Now you shall help us or die," he told the man. "You do not deserve the treatment of a prisoner of war, and you will not receive it. We are Federals. I am Kelso. Now you know what to expect." People in Missouri came to know what to expect from Kelso. Week in and week out in southwest Missouri, the threat was not usually from large armies marching up from Arkansas, but from raids by smaller groups of Confederates or local guerrilla bands and gangs of bandits. And Kelso, when he became a cavalry officer, was kind of this anti-insurgency force attacking these local groups, sometimes in groups of 50, sometimes 20, sometimes 10, sometimes by himself. Kelso in the 8th Missouri State Militia Cavalry spent most of the war battling these bushwhackers, they were called. It was against them that Kelso made a name for himself. Stories about Kelso circulated in Missouri through the end of the 19th century. A journalist wrote in the 1890s that his name was, quote, still spoken with a shudder by many people along the Missouri and the Arkansas border, unquote. Some of the stories about the man might sound like nursery tales of mythical desperados, the journalist wrote, but he assured his readers that they were well authenticated by witnesses still living. The article described Kelso as brave to the point of recklessness and marveled at his preternatural composure under fire. But the reporter also described him as a remorseless, ferocious, inhuman rebel killer who butchered his victims with an unforgiving heart. Local historians in the 1880s and 90s too interviewed people who knew Kelso or knew of him or fought with him or against him. Here's one of the stories they told about him. Early one morning, Kelso and his men surrounded one of the houses in which some of the bandits were known to have spent the night. Kelso himself taking the most dangerous position. Coming up in front of the house, he saw 3 bandits within, and keeping his eyes on them and his hands on his shotgun in the position of ready, crossed the fence and started for the door. In a moment after crossing the fence, a big dog came snarling and growling at him and seized him by the calf of the leg. Not in the least disconcerted by this unexpected attack of the dog, he stopped and, keeping his eyes on the bandits, took with his right hand his revolver from the scabbard and, feeling for the dog's neck, shot the beast dead. He proceeded as if nothing had happened and entering the door, found that the bandits had escaped through the opposite door. His daring amazed them so that they fled without firing a single shot. Friend and foe alike marveled at one writer described as the fearless and energetic manner in which Kelso had hunted down Confederate partisans, rebel bandits, and bushwhackers, frequently penetrating their most secret hiding places and engaging them in hand-to-hand conflicts. 19th century historian Wiley Britton had fought for the Union in Missouri during the war and wrote books afterward based on his own experience and on several thousand post-war interviews he conducted there, investigating pension and property claims for the War Department. He wrote, many witnesses who had reminiscences to relate of Kelso's daring acts during the war. He also had a brother and brother-in-law who had served with Kelso and corresponded with the man himself. While those who sympathized with the Confederacy continued to hate Kelso, Britton thought of him as a hero who, he said, was without fear and was a genius in many respects, and like a tiger in his warlike activities. Another post-war historian, R.I. Holcomb, writing from Kelso's hometown, took a dimmer view of the man. Writing in the early 1880s, he called Kelso a desperate man who was fanatical in his unionism and who believed that all Confederates were traitors deserving death. It is said of him, Holcomb continued, that Kelso killed many a man without cause. Stories are told of him that make him appear fit only to be denominated a monster and entitled only to execration. Doubtless some of these stories are exaggerations, but the fact remains that Kelso was a bad man and held human life in very cheap estimation. Both historians commented on Kelso's intellect as well as his courage. He was a great student of languages, philosophy, and mathematics, Britton wrote. It is said, Holcomb wrote, that he always carried a book in his saddle pockets and frequently engaged in the study of mental philosophy and the subtleties of metaphysics while lying in the brush by the roadside waiting to get a drop on a rebel. The journalist writing in the early 1890s wondered how, quote, this strange man could return from a bloody scout and take up his studies with as much earnestness as though he had been at college preparing for examination. For this writer, this mysterious combination of intellectual tastes and earnest idealism, along with martial courage, cold cunning, and hate, made Kelso one of the enigmas of the Civil War. All right, you can see how I have shifted from Kelso's point of view to the stories that others told about him. And again, the memoir at the Huntington breaks off on that last page shortly after the Battle of Springfield in 1863. Yes, I had other sources, military records, county histories, newspapers, Kelso's own later publications, but there's nothing like having these detailed accounts of his experiences. I, of course, wish that there might be the lost second half of his autobiography out there somewhere. I looked everywhere I could possibly could to find it. But I resigned myself to having to write the post-1863 half of his life without it. I kind of worried that the tone would change. You'd be reading the book and it would feel different after 1863. So that was my concern in writing this. Some of my sense of John R. Kelso's Civil War did come from other sources. The fat pension file for Kelso at the National Archives details his wounds and the impact they had on his later life. While battling guerrillas on August 7th, 1863, he received the contents of a double-barrel shotgun in his chest and his left hand. He was able, he talks about, he was able to pick out a lot of affidavits in the pension files, able to pick out the shot with a knife at night, but he was not able to do anything about his hand, and 2 of his fingers remained crippled the rest of his life. They remained embedded there. So a month later, after he gets hit with a shotgun blast, on September 7th, he was riding with his men after bushwhackers had captured some provisioners' wagons. His horse, Hawkeye, getting tangled in a hitch rope in the pursuit, turned a somersault and landed on Kelso. Both of the lieutenant's hips were injured. The right one was dislocated. For the rest of his life, Kelso complained of a hernia and kidney problems that he attributed to this accident. He also injured his left shoulder, leaving it permanently higher than the right one. His injuries, however, did not keep him from the field long. The official records show him attacking rebels in Jasper County in November 1863. In the spring of 1864, after being promoted to captain, he rode against the 2nd Cherokee Indian Regiment at Spavinaw, Arkansas, insurgents at Middle Creek, and a guerrilla band near Neosho. His commanding officer reported that on an expedition on August 13th, 1864, Kelso engaged and killed one Lieutenant Baxter, a noted bushwhacker. In early October, Kelso was spying again, providing intelligence on the advance of Confederate General Price's army before the Battle of Westport. But after the war, his injuries became progressively more debilitating. He would be reminded of his wounds whenever he tried to get in or out of a chair, put on an overcoat, or touch the buckshot still lodged in his hand. In the 1870s, he was judged to be 2/3 disabled. And by the 1880s, when he was in his mid-50s, the only outdoor work he could do was weeding a little in the garden on his knees. The official records, though, were nothing like the rich descriptions in his memoir. I still long for that second half of the autobiography. And then one day, every time I say this, you feel those tingles. Then one day, in my office, out of the blue, I was reviewing the page proofs for this. Bloody engagements. This is the stuff the Huntington Civil War chapters. We're reviewing the page proof, and I get a call out of nowhere. Somebody who identifies himself and says, "My name is Joe Dew, and I'm the great-great-grandson of John R. Kelso. And I have some manuscripts." Magical words to a historian, and I have some manuscripts, and yes, indeed, those manuscripts turned out to be the complete version of Kelso's autobiography in his own hand, over 250,000 words, including the second half that I didn't have, detailing the years 1863 to 1885. Then another relative who had heard from the first one comes out of the woodwork and says, "Well, I have 500 pages of other Kelso manuscript material from his post-war life." That was a great day. Historical biographies can grow almost organically from the sources you have. My challenge now was not let Kelso's voice and point of view overwhelm my story. He's a good writer, and he tells these rich stories, but I didn't want that to overwhelm my attempt to tell the story. So I need to step outside of his perspectives to supplement or sometimes to challenge it whenever I could. Sometimes military records could afford other points of view on a battle that he describes. That, by the way, is the first picture, one of the pages of the Lost second half. They were in school composition books this time, not in like that big volume. So as I say, sometimes the military records, in particular the Battle of Neosho, which was this disaster, a defeat for the Union forces. It was such a disaster that the military ordered an investigation of what went wrong. So I have the details of the different officers being interviewed and the investigation of the battle itself, and I have Kelso's own long account, which includes this scene where the horses are getting free and he's in the midst of this stampede and he's trying not to get stepped on. This happened in May of 1862. The next chapter in Kelso's curious story is his election to Congress in 1864. Encouraged by his Unionist admirers, Captain Kelso took a short leave from his regiment and rode through his district on his favorite horse, Hawkeye, campaigning while carrying his distinctive oversized shotgun. He became more widely known in circulated press accounts as the guerrilla fighter who had vowed that he would not cut his hair until he had killed 25 bushwhackers with his own hand. He won a very close election against the Republican incumbent, and the newspapers described him in the spring of 1865 passing through St. Louis on his way to Washington with his hair now close cropped because his vow had been fulfilled. The national press picked up the story and multiplied the body count. A profile of Congressman Kelso, first published in the New York Herald Tribune, described him as a man, quote, with eyes and hair of midnight black, yet looking and moving like a tiger. This is John R. Kelso of extreme southern Missouri, who is said to have killed more than 60 rebels with his own hand. He is scarred and shot from soul to crown, and in the border episodes of the war holds a strange, wild prominence. But here in Congress, he is quiet, amiable, grave, a scene in odd consonance with the dark and bloody vistas he has haunted. Even the Missouri press, which usually like to laugh when Eastern tenderfoots romanticized and exaggerated the daring deeds of Missouri heroes, helped to build the legend of John R. Kelso. The Springfield Patriot snorted derisively at an article on Wild Bill Hickok in Harper's Monthly, which claimed that Bill had personally dispatched several hundred rebels with his own hands. We dare say, the Missouri paper retorted, that Captain Kelso, our present member of Congress, did double the execution with his own hands on the Johnnies during the war that Bill did. Kelso actually did serve with Wild Bill Hickok for part of the war. Kelso's military service record noted that he had personally killed 26 enemy combatants. After the surrender at Appomattox, Kelso believed that political resistance threatened to overturn what had been won on the battlefield. In a political speech he gave in Missouri in September 1865, he said that the war had simply assumed the form of political contest. Armies are no longer hurled upon armies, he said. Yet the real struggle, the irrepressible conflict of antagonistic principles is still going on. Slavery, though dead in name, still exists in reality. The rebellion, though overthrown in arms, is by no means subdued in spirit, nor has treason yet been made odious. Unpunished traitors, emboldened by the lenity of our government, are still plotting its destruction. Kelso, the sole independent Republican in the House, aligned himself with the radical wing of the large Republican majority. Radicals insisted that the rights of citizens, including black ones, must be protected. Like the leading radical in the House, Thaddeus Stevens, Kelso believed that the seceding states had given up their rights as states and could now be treated as conquered territories. Like the leading Senate radical, Charles Sumner, Kelso held that the Declaration of Independence was as foundational as anything in the Constitution, and that it demanded equality before the law. When President Andrew Johnson tried to obstruct the Reconstruction agenda, Kelso and a Missouri colleague were the first in Congress to call for his impeachment. After his term was up, he went back to Springfield to teach school. He tried to regain his seat in the fall of 1868, running on a Negro equality and anti-bondholder platform, but he was beaten badly. Writing a quarter century later, the author of that article in the St. Louis Republic thought that Kelso's rejection at the ballot box was a sign of a sobered electorate that had been rapidly distancing itself from the fanaticism that had provoked the war and produced such horrific bloodshed. Another commentator remembering Kelso in the 1890s wrote that things have changed very much since the days when Missouri voters would send a man like Kelso to Washington. And it would be hard to find a man who actually voted for him to now acknowledge it in public. Kelso, however, may have become politically unpalatable, less for his reputation for violence than for his progressive politics. After all, other violent Missourians, like the gambling gunslinger Wild Bill Hickok and the sociopathic criminal Jesse James, would be turned into folk heroes in the post-war period, the latter by a neo-Confederate apologist. But as white Southerners embraced the myth of the Confederacy's noble lost cause and white Northerners retreated from the egalitarian promises of Reconstruction, a champion of African-American political equality and someone who was against the entrenched power of wealth cut against the grain of a hardening white conservatism. The St. Louis Republican article noted that in later years, Kelso, quote, became a fiery champion of the causes of the wage slave. He attacked the greed of corporations and capitalists, which with as much bitterness as he ever denounced rebels on the Missouri border in the eventful days of the 1860s. For the author, however, Kelso's political convictions were merely a new channel for his fanaticism, a new fad for his restless mind. Kelso had left Missouri in 1872 after the death of one young son from tetanus, and then 10 days later, the suicide of his teenage son, and the subsequent dissolution of his second marriage. He moved to the Wild West Railroad boomtown of Modesto. And this bottom picture, Kelso this is part of the Teachers Institute. He becomes a teacher again. This is in Modesto. That's Kelso there. And there's some kind of wild stories about Modesto. It's kind of like what you think about the Wild West with saloons and gamblers and vigilantes and other craziness. In the 1870s too, he would continue to pursue the studies that led him from Christianity to atheism, delivering the lectures that would constitute the 5 books, now all very rare and never big sellers, that he published in the next decade. He also became an outspoken critic of conventional attitudes about sex and marriage, and a promoter of spiritualism. In Kelso's final years, his political radicalism intensified. In 1885, he moved to Longmont, Colorado. He declared himself to be an anarchist at a Colorado rally in 1889 and tried to explain what he meant by anarchism in his final book, Government Analyzed, a work his third wife, Etta Dunbar Kelso, completed after his death in 1891. In that book, Kelso also reflected upon what at the end of his life he considered to be the misguided patriotic blindness that had caused him to kill his fellow men in the war, realizing that he had merely substituted a sacralized nation for the God that he had left behind when he abandoned Christianity. Quote, believing that I was thereby fulfilling a sacred duty and proving myself a good, brave, and patriotic man, I cheerfully bore, for more than 3 years, every conceivable hardship and privation, took part in nearly 100 bloody engagements. With my own hands slew a goodly number of brave men, and after the fearful tragedy had been successfully enacted, I looked back with exultation upon the part I had enacted. how blind I was, and yet how honest. How blindly, how piously, how patriotically inhuman even the best of us are capable of being made by superstition. Nearly done writing his chapter on war, at the end of his discussion of the American Civil War and slavery, and in the middle of a sentence, John R. Kelso, in early January 1891, suffering from chronic pain in his chest and abdomen, put down his pen. Though he probably had stomach cancer, he and his wife thought the cause was a ball that he had been unable to remove from his chest after being hit by that shotgun blast in 1863. He thought that last rebel bullet had been festering beneath his sternum for nearly three decades. And now the Civil War was finally killing him. He died on January 26th. Kelso's writings then offer different interpretations of the larger meaning of the Civil War. When he first stood before his pro-Southern neighbors in Buffalo in the spring of 1861, he voiced a commitment to the Union that was nothing less than a sacred cause. The struggle, as he explained it, was between traitors who would ruin the peaceful and prosperous country they could no longer rule, and those who would preserve the Republican government that had been created by the Revolutionary forefathers and had stood as a beacon of freedom to the world. But after the Confederate victories and Union retreat from Southwest Missouri in the fall of 1861, he had other reasons to fight. When pro-Southern neighbors stole his property, burned down his house, and drove his family and the families of other loyal friends into the bitter cold to suffer and some of them to die, Kelso became motivated by personal revenge. He acknowledged, too, that he had an ambition to lead men into battle and make a name for himself. By 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation had added the abolition of slavery to preserving the Union as a war aim, and Kelso too came to see slavery as the center of the contest, slavery as the utter denial of the ideal of political equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and as a manifestation of the tyrannical behavior of a small group of aristocrats over the common American people, white and black. He rode the radical Republican wave to Congress, joining those who believed that the South and America at large had to be thoroughly reconstructed, both politically and socially, to live up to the nation's highest ideals. 30 years after he had stood on that Buffalo stage and pledged his life to save the Union, and 25 years after he had stood in Congress demanding that African Americans be given the right to vote if their freedom from slavery were to have meaning, John R. Kelso had come to see the patriotism that had prompted him to fight as a delusion. And the outcome of the Civil War is a cruel joke. Seeing in America by the last decade of the 19th century riddled with corruption and ruled by an oligarchy of large corporations, Kelso bitterly regretted his wartime exploits. What he had once thought of as a patriotic heroism, he now considered a misguided righteousness of the most dangerous kind, a blindness that led to state-sanctioned destruction and slaughter. The reporter in the St. Louis Republic, puzzling over Kelso's character 2 years after his death, could only conclude that, quote, John R. Kelso was one of the enigmas of the war. The Kelso that emerges from his own manuscript pages, describing his varied experiences as an infantry private, a cavalry officer, a guerrilla hunter, a spy, is as a coldly efficient killer in the midst of a soldier's bloody engagements, but also a man with tender sentiments and powerful passions that he found almost too much to bear. He fought bravely for his country, but also thought deeply about the causes of the war and the moral character of the struggle. His broader life story has other things to tell us. His political career is rich with insights about the connections between local and national politics. His frank discussions of his private life provide a vantage upon family dynamics, domestic gender politics, marriage, and sexuality. His post-war writings illuminate American religious and political radicalism in the second half of the 19th century. Earlier, in talking about Jill Lepore's piece, I said that I thought most historical biographies try to do both what she attributes to biography and to microhistory. That is, they try to recapitulate a life as best they can in all its singularity. But they also try to make the case for doing so by showing the ways that that life illuminates the broader culture and the workings of history. in the epilogue to this book, I try to get at some of these questions. I had opened the book, but kind of by invoking Kelso's Whitman-esque multiplicity. You know, he was a teacher, a preacher, a soldier, a spy, a congressman, scholar, lecturer, author, a Methodist, atheist, spiritualist, anarchist. In the epilogue, though, I explore the notion of Kelso as a representative man. Alluding, of course, to Ralph Waldo Emerson's Representative Men, a famous collection of essays published in 1850. And Emerson's Representative Men achieved greatness by embodying ideals with a capital I. Plato, the philosopher, Shakespeare, the poet, Napoleon, the man of the world. And Kelso too wrote an essay about great men like this, who represented areas of thought or behavior because their genius forever changed the course of human progress. They were giants towering above others in their age. Plato, Shakespeare, Napoleon are on Kelso's list too. And they came to be regarded as representatives of quote, the principles they have taught, the modes of character they have illustrated, the arts and sciences in which they have excelled, and the systems they have founded. Whatever Kelso had aspired to be when he was a young boy reading biographies by the fireplace, he was not a great man in this sense. He never achieved greatness by his exemplary accomplishments or his historical influence. But Kelso was a representative man of 19th century America in a different way, embodying with his own peculiar vitality modes of character enmeshed in larger systems and principles not of his own making. Or, as I say in the epilogue, perhaps he was at least 4 such characters, which I describe as kind of ideal types: the evangelical Christian, the enlightened critic, the sentimental hero, and the radical reformer. These modes of character that Kelso personified did not form a tidy sequence, one replacing the previous. Even as he cast ideas and beliefs aside, old habits endured within larger, persisting patterns of experience, as he himself eventually recognized. Ways of being that he thought he had left behind when he walked out of the church: faith in a higher power, reverence for sacred doctrines, obedience to authorities' commands, were instead transferred to his political religion. The radical, I won't talk about each of these ideal types, I'll just kind of wrap up here. The radical reformer combined aspects of the other 3, the evangelical Christian, the enlightened critic, and the sentimental hero. As a radical Republican, he was willing to overturn 19th century America's racial, gender, and political order. He wanted to disfranchise rebel whites and enfranchise black freedmen, give the vote and equal rights to women, and dissolve the defeated southern states for an extended period of democratic tutelage under Reconstruction. As an anarchist, he would have gone even further, destroying corporate power and dismantling the state to reorganize social life on the basis of liberty, equality, and voluntary association. Here again, he foregrounded an enlightened critical analysis that claimed to demystify political superstitions, unmask powerful forces of economic oppression, and use reason and common sense to topple tyranny. Here again, he voiced a passionate faith in a higher cause. And as he publicly proclaimed his unpopular opinions, he again appealed to his audience's sympathy for his brave sincerity, and he invoked the language of heroic martyrdom. If as a Christian he had modeled himself after Jesus, and as a soldier he enjoyed being compared to the crafty Revolutionary War hero Francis Marion, and as a free thinker he had idolized Thomas Paine, as an anarchist he turned back to Jesus, to a radical, this worldly Jesus anyway, preaching the gospel of anarchistic reform and willing to die for the truth that would set others free. If nothing else, Kelso can be seen as a representative man of 19th century America in this complex intermingling of sentimentality and rationalism, sympathy and self-assertion, aspiration and despair, violence and tears. But more importantly, in the end, he was himself. Biography is not an efficient conveyance of some neat historical thesis. If it does not portray the irreducible singularity of a particular life, it has failed. When Kelso's daughter handed down the manuscripts containing her father's handwritten autobiography to the next generation, she included a note, quote, "Do not be too severe in criticism of a life laid bare with few reservations." Be as charitable as you can. Not knowing and loving him as I did and do, I do not expect you to understand the mistakes he made, unquote. Perhaps, though, even without a daughter's love, readers of A Life Laid Bare might come to understand. Thank you.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions. By the way, I think they're going down to put their do a poster downstairs at an arts and science thing about what's it at? What is the thing that was? What's the actual event? Arts and science.
The alumni awards or something.
Alumni awards. Anyway, so after this is over, after you've had plenty of time to ask Chris questions, you can go downstairs and see what they're doing. So who's got a question for Chris?
Sorry, yeah, I'm a freshman, and last semester I took a humanities course, and so we read Herodotus, and in prepping for his histories, my professor was like, you have to take everything he says with a grain of salt. He wasn't there at this time, or if he was, there's a chance he could have exaggerated something. So, like, in your readings of Kelso's manuscripts and other works about him, obviously some of them are fantastical, some of them were not. How did you judge what to believe and put in, and what to be wary of and exclude?
Well, that's a very good question, and that was like my first question when I was at the Huntington and I'm reading and said, well, did this really happen? How do I know this? This could just be bullshit, right? You could just be fictionalizing all these stories. So the thing you try to do is, whenever you can, are there other sources that corroborate what you say? And the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. Some of the incidents you describe, there's no other accounts, or the military records will just give a bare bones account of, the regiment went out, Kelso squad did this, 3 people were killed, 4 people, blah blah blah. John R. Kelso commended for bravery, and you don't get any of the details. I try to be as clear to the reader of the book as I can that, when I know, when there are differences, when he said, 10 people were killed, and the official records say no, 6 or no, 14, either in the notes or in the text, I try to clarify those things. I did notice as I was reading along in this, that Kelso does not make himself the hero of the story. Sometimes he's clearly not. He talks about his failures very, very frankly. And that gave me more confidence in some of the things he was describing as, actually had happened. So I think I did all those things. I tried to use other sources when I could to establish what was there, to present his account of events, but also cue the reader into, when I don't know if this happened or not, this is what he said, this is what we know.
Rob in the back.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, thanks very much. Really, really interesting paper to hear. I didn't know this story at all, so thank you. 2 questions, if I may. One is about some of the materials. So you showed a lot of black and white graphite drawings as you went through to punctuate. I wondered if you could say us a bit about the provenance of those. They seem relatively contemporary. But, and then if they are, my sort of follow-up question for that was, how does the existence of that kind of material, which so focuses on episodes, affect or frame how you then go about telling similar stories, but without such an episodic structure?
Right.
And then the sort of more substantive question was about the anarchism of his life. You sort of explained that quite largely in terms of his reactions towards parts of late 19th century America. But of course, the whole point of anarchism is that he rejects the nation in many respects, and that there's a broader community, an international community of practice of anarchists writing in the 1880s. And a lot of what you were sort of saying struck me as something very similar that Russian anarchists, for example, are writing, people like Kropotkin before the letter. So does he have any kind of engagement with those wider international or transnational communities of practice in his sort of thinking as it comes together? Particularly that last book of his that you know.
Right. His discovery of anarchism is very interesting because, and in a lot of ways, it's very personal too. He is filing all these affidavits again and again, trying to get a full disability pension. And he's increasingly frustrated. It takes years, and he's got to, I risked my life and I suffered these, and he was so frustrated by this. And he's ultimately denied. There was like and I go through this like a chart of, you're this amount disabled for your finger, you're this amount disabled for your shoulder, and the kind of this bureaucratic process leaves him basically without the pension he was looking for. And he writes a piece right after this experience, just kind of excoriating, government bureaucracy, and you can tell that it's resonating in very personal ways, although the piece doesn't. And it's almost like he's grappling, trying to find the language of anarchism that he hasn't discovered yet. But then he does. And by the time he writes Government Analyzed, he has read some of these things. Now, one of the main American anarchistic journals publishes a devastating review of his book and just describes how he's confused and how he doesn't understand this, he hasn't read this theorist, he hasn't read that theorist. And some of that criticism was fair and some of it wasn't. I go through that kind of closely because I'm trying to take his ideas seriously. So he never was an original thinker in any way. He never was as plugged into the intellectual world as he thought he was. So he's trying to combine. There are like in that book on one page he'll sound like an individualist, on another he'll sound like he's leaning toward communism. It's not really a well-crafted argument in that way. But I think in terms of kind of an emotional expression, and one of the talks that he gives at this kind of these celebrations they had after the Haymarket Affair, he gives the keynote address at one of these, and that's when he's invoking Jesus, and that's when he's it's really a call to arms. It's a kind of a powerful, even if not all that intellectually coherent, a very powerful statement of against the corruption and the kind of this envisioning this new age that he hopes is going to come. Your first question, I'm glad you asked it because I didn't know how to talk about those illustrations in ways that didn't kind of derail me from what I was going to say. I finished the manuscript. I sent the manuscript to the publisher, and I was sorry that it was done because I loved working on this. Every moment I loved this project. It was like a surprise, not just getting the new stuff, but just learning things that I didn't know about before, doing kinds of history that I didn't do before. I wasn't a Civil War historian. I hadn't done a lot of census records and all that stuff. As Jeff said, I was more.
There's not a single shot fired in either of those books.
No shots fired in my other books. That's right. So this was different for me. So I love this. And it was hard to give it up. But while I was waiting for it to be published, I kept thinking, especially the Civil War episodes, as you say, were so visual. So, this should be a movie. This should be a movie. Well, lacking $40 million, I couldn't make a movie. But I said, well, maybe, I had a colleague that did a kind of graphic history and illustrated, in his case, the life of a boxer. And maybe I could do something like that. So that led to the creation of a website, and where I summarized some of these episodes. And I contacted an old friend from high school who was an artist and asked him, how he visualized these episodes. And the art that you saw is by him. His name is Robert Davidson, lives in Connecticut. He's a high school art teacher, but it was a lot of fun working with him. And here's what I wrote. How do you see it? And so that's where these things. I should have at least said that these are not from the 19th century. They were just illustrations that I'm using for these purposes. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could go more in depth on the religious transition he takes from being Methodist into going into the more atheist side of things.
Well, I do go more in depth. There's like 500 pages on the topic, and
I'm one of these discount flyers.
Okay, how to do this very shortly. He's a Methodist minister. He has this grueling conversion experience to become a Methodist. But gradually he's moving in much more liberal directions. And he's struggling with his kind of private ideas at the same time that he's a very popular preacher. But then his marriage falls apart. He and his wife separate, and his congregation turns against him in ways that shock him. and blame him for everything, blame him for the fault of the marriage, and start, spreading rumors. So he leaves Methodism by, as he said, throwing a bomb in the midst of the congregation. Like basically, he stands up at a conference and just trashes their whole theology. And he moves, and so he moves at that point, this is in the 1850s, he moves away from Methodism to a very kind of liberal, more deistic kind of faith. And I talk more specifically about the kinds of things that he's thinking about. The final turn to atheism is in the war itself. It's in that snowstorm scene. He says that was the moment when I said, because he hears that woman who's giving birth, crying to Jesus. Jesus, please, save my son or daughter, I can't remember. Save my baby from me, and the baby dies, and then she dies. And he said, I knew, and that was it. There's no personal God up there. The God up there, how come the God doesn't ever pay attention to poor people lying in the snow? He only seems to pay attention to the rich people. And that was the moment he embraces atheism. Much later in his life, after he struggles with his son's suicide, the loss of his other son, it haunted him. He becomes a spiritualist. He thinks that their spirits are still there, hovering about him, comforting him, but he's still an atheist. He thinks that his spiritualism it's just, it was empirical evidence. I'm convinced that, in the world of nature that, spirits can, transcend the death of the body and live on, but that doesn't mean I believe in God. I don't. So he's an atheistic spiritualist after that. So, and he gives lectures on spiritualism, but so you can see that the first turn, second turn to atheism, the spiritualism comes much later.
Tara.
Thank you so much for the talk. Is there any record of what his family, his wife or his kids, thought about him going off to become this killer during the war?
Yeah.
How they reacted to that kind of reputation?
Yeah, I don't talk at all. There's this wonderful, I don't have anything from, I have some of the stuff that he records that his wife wrote to him. But she was furious, basically. And, he would write these long things back to her about, this adventure, and it was so exciting, I almost got killed. And she's like furious. Like, what are you doing? And he would go home and expect to be warmly embraced. And when he goes home, when he's wounded, it's cold to him, and this hurts him, and there's a lot of tension there. You can see the marriage falling apart in part because of that. He expects her to share in this notion of, he's brave and he's heroic, and she says, you're our breadwinner, and you seem to always offer yourself for the most dangerous job here. It's like you're trying to get killed. And there's this whole other thing about Dr. Hubby. Dr. Hubby was a friend, a handsome friend with a waxen mustache back home, and he's worried about Dr. Hubby seducing his wife. And it turns out that it wasn't just his paranoid fantasies, there was something going on there. So there's all this, stuff about Dr. In fact, the last, in the January of 1863, the last page in the Huntington thing, right after the Battle of Springfield, one of the last things he says, and then I got a letter that made me suspicious about Dr. Hubby. And then that's another thing it's like, what happened? And he had all these kind of radical notions about women's rights, and there's a whole thing I talk about in there about in Springfield, this little women's rights group that he's invested in, and yet then there are all these kind of sexual problems with him and his wife. So there's this complex thing going on there. And after the deaths of his children, that marriage ends, and then his final marriage is to that woman in Colorado. So I could go on about his children too. There's some of his children. There's this weird, his son, John R. Kelso Jr. I was trying to, what happened to him? And I'm trying to trace him through the records. I'm going through all these records, and he just kind of vanishes, and I don't know what happens to him. I'm not going to be able to find it. There's a great photograph of John R. Kelso Jr. that it turns out that at some point, I don't know if you can see this, but it's John R. Kelso Jr. standing in front of a mirror. And so there's two of them. And at some point in his middle age, he changes his name. He doesn't want to be John R. Kelso Jr. anymore. And it's not clear why, but he says, I don't want to share the same name as a horse thief. But he didn't mean an actual horse thief, or calling someone as a horse thief is like that son of a bitch. Kelso, the elder, still talks about being estranged from him. So he vanished from the records because he changed his name to something else, to John Howard. So there was this tension there with the son as well. The daughter loved him, the son was estranged from him, and most of the rest of the people forgot all about it by the turn of the 20th century.
It sounds like a lot to take. Who else?
Some of your answers to these most recent questions have maybe kind of illuminated a little bit of his earlier life, his life at least in the 1850s. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about his upbringing, what makes for his fervent unionism, which sounds like it very much puts him at odds with the majority of the population in Buffalo, at least. Like what drives the episodes that you spent a significant amount of time and really puts him apart from what he can do?
Yeah, his unionism is very much free soilism. It's very much a strain of racism in him, a very clear one. And sometimes he even uses it for political advantage to try to appeal to his white voters. He believed in the political equality of everyone, but certainly not the social equality. And he talks about this as kind of an irrational sense that he had, this racism, and yet he never transcends it. He can't get away from it. But his initially, it's very much free soil and very much hostility, the arrogance of the slaveholders. Not how they treated black people, but how they treated poor whites like him. And looking down their noses at someone who works with their hands the way he did. And he hated that. And that's how he framed the Civil War. And in slavery, he just saw as an exemplar of that, this kind of aristocratic sensibility, making other people work for you, but not a lot of sympathy for the blacks.
I'm interested in the first title you have there, teacher. Could you tell us a little bit about what kind of things he wrote about as being a teacher, and then if he had any kind of commentary on the development of the school system in Missouri and how he was a part of that, and if you have any comparisons to California?
Yeah, he spent most of his life as a teacher, and he was devoted to it. He loved doing it. His great scheme after he got out of Congress was to build an academy, the Kelso Academy it was called, in Springfield, and he kind of advertised him as if this is going to be a new radical new place, and we're going to make so much more educational progress with your students. And all the rich guys in town said, oh, this is a great idea, we support you. And he invests all his money and he builds this building and he opens the doors and 7 people show up. And he feels stabbed in the back by this. And basically this ruins him.
So we killed them all. No.
Yeah.
Do you know off the top of your head where in Springfield that building was?
Off the top of my head, no. In the book, yes.
Okay, sorry.
Yes. It became, after he sold it, it became a convent.
Okay, I got it right.
Twist. What was his do you have a particular educational theory, Chris? I mean, what was his? He seems to have a theory about everything, or at least he recently read a book about it. What was his? Did he have a particular?
Well, he described how how he thought the classroom should work. He described, it was all about him, really. It was all about, the schoolmaster will inspire the students by his own character, and they will love learning because of charismatic me. That's basically what his theory was. But he was really trying to, push the students to get more work done in the same amount of time. That's how he advertised it to people. And he said his son was one of the very best students. He was accomplished in this, he was accomplished in that. But Kelso was kind of a strict parent, and was upset with his son for dabbling in tobacco. Kelso didn't drink, didn't smoke, thought those things were terrible. His son formed a tobacco habit. His sister caught him with it, and the son was so despairing that he had shown this weakness that he took his father's pistol and shot himself in the head. And that devastated him.
Jay, had your hand up?
Well, I was just gonna say that I was so enthusiastic about the story until that last bit. But I am ready to go kill 25 rebels and then present it later on. But I love your story. It's so exciting. And the 4 categories, I don't remember them all on top of my head from what you said at the end, but it seems like a good way of giving it meaning, but without imposing too much of rigidity on it. So I really like that. I guess my question, or maybe it'll come out as a comment, is that, the idea of great men and representative men, that as the 19th century unfolds, it becomes both democratized, that more people, lay claim to being a great man, but also self-promotional. Like, it's quite different from the great men of the age of revolutions, which have the sort of group of acolytes that are promoting them in the press. By the late 19th century, people are kind of saying, I'm a great man, here's my narrative of life in the West. And I guess what struck me is that he doesn't publish these books. He's actually not a very successful self-promoter. And so I was wondering why that was. So he's very typical of that type of his era, but doesn't seem quite as successful as some of the other.
He tried. At one point, he works for 10 years school teaching in California. And he says, all right, I'm going to be a free thinker. And I'm going to join the lecture circuit, and I'm going to tour the country. And others were doing this, and others were making, I can't remember his name, Ingersoll, the great orator, kind of free thought orator who's making hundreds, thousands of dollars touring around the country. So he had a model to do this. And he's reading free thought journals, and there's like an intellectual community he can plug himself into. He says, all right, I'm going to publish these books. I have all these lectures. I'm going to hit the road, hit the circuit. And his health breaks down. He travels across the country. He goes to New York. He gets some of the books published. He delivers talks in a few places, but then his voice starts to fail. And he's devastated. He's so devastated, he falls into this horrible depression. This dream of becoming this great man after the war was clearly not going to work.
So damn rebel bullets who said
Yeah.
bullet under his sternum. Zach.
So, did he ever pledge to kill 25 bureaucrats? No, my real question. I think you said something about him advocating for the vote for African Americans.
Yeah.
Like he pushed or wanted the 15th Amendment. I guess my question is, how far did he go? Because you said he was racist, but that's kind of farther than some would go, even advocating for the vote. Did he talk about property, or he had not gone that radical yet? Like as far as like redistributing property, thinking about that.
Well, he wants to redistribute property to slave owners.
Yeah, but to enslave people. So like, was he going that
I don't
direction?
think so. No, into the federal coffers, and then
Sure.
Yeah. What was the other part of the question?
I'm curious how far he went down that.
Well, I mean,
road.
his logic was based on, these black soldiers fought for us, and they were. And he talked about all the critiques. Well, they're not educated, blah blah blah. And he said, well, they were smart enough to be loyal, weren't they? And if they were brave enough to cast bullets, why can't they cast ballots? And he would far prefer to have them voting than the rebels who had lost the right to vote but were clamoring to get it back. And you could say that there's like a cynical political calculation in all of this, right? Because if you re-enfranchise the rebels and don't enfranchise the black male voters, then the conservatives are going to triumph in Missouri, which is what happened anyway, right? And he saw that happening. So some say that this was just for radicals like him, that this was a kind of cynical way to, we want to get people who are going to vote for us, who are going to vote for the radical Republican ticket. And if we let these other guys in, it's going to be, the white Democrats. But there was more to it than that. So I think it was this interesting, he was both racist and anti-racist at the same time. And to see how those things fit together. And I don't think just cynically, but I think, there's a logic to how they fit together.
Okay, well, I think we're almost getting, is there like one more question, or are we go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, this was a wonderful talk. So in those hundreds of pages that he's written, is there any episode or story that he tells more than once? And does his interpretation or memory change? Because I think that's something that's interesting about biography, how people remember things differently later on.
Right, that he tells more than once. It's a very good question. No, and when I got the one of the things that when I got the expanded version of the biography that was written just a couple years after the first one in Huntington, that's okay. Is he when he rewrites this? Are we going to see any changes? Are we going to see? Is he going to even in subtle ways? Is he going to change it? The answer is no. He didn't change anything. He did add stuff. You know, and some of the stuff he added was quite interesting. And you wonder, well, why didn't he say that the first time through? And that's the only way that, like, there are no other things that I could use as well. You know, he might have written letters about this, but I don't have any of that. I just have these two versions, and the things that he repeats are pretty much the same.
Okay, well, if that's nothing, somebody was checking online, but I don't think, but it must not be too many. But let's just thank, I would thank Chris, and also, it sounds to me like we're really, one of the things we're also learning here is there's this whole this person who never gets thrown into the mix. Missouri Civil War history and Missouri history. It sounds like he's got a lot to contribute, even though it's maybe it's even though a lot of it may not be consistent with each other, and it's kind of like it's kind of serial extremist, but it sounds like you got a lot of experiences and a lot of stories that people hadn't been used in the past. So everyone go out and everyone go send for that book. And let's thank Chris Grasso very much. Oh yeah, well, so good news and bad news. Good news and bad news. The good news is Pursuit of Happiness Hour is on, and there'll be plenty of logbooks.